It has been 25 years since our church first made a confession to God and to Indigenous people for our participation in the residential school system. This afternoon, we remember, mark, and recommit ourselves to that confession. We are honored to have members of the National Indigenous Ministries Council with us. They are sitting over here in almost a circle, a representative circle, but also face towards us, which I think, as I look at you, that you've kind of included us in your circle in a way, and we are honored to be with you. We also have with us, among us, survivors today, and I've been noted that the survivors would be invited to stand should they choose to do so at this time. We want to honor you. We recognize how difficult it is to share your stories with us and to share your lives with us, and we are honored to be in your presence this afternoon. Thank you. We are grateful for this time, for the witness of survivors, and for their patience with us as we seek to learn, to turn, and to seek justice and healing for all who have been harmed by this legacy. I also have a few words to share about the poster boards on the far wall over here, which I mentioned this morning. This is more information which will help us to understand. I would like to draw your attention to the series of posters that are displayed at the side of the Assembly Hall to my right. These posters are part of a larger exhibit called Shades of Our Sisters, created by the Sewink and Carpenter families in 2016. Shades of Our Sisters has grown to include the stories of 8 courageous families. The exhibit has traveled to 11 communities over the last 2 years and seeks to honor missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, transgender, and Two-Spirit people by celebrating the stories of their lives. Named by the families, Shades of Our Sisters originates from an old Ojibwe story. Within this teaching, shades are said to be what is left behind on this earth when a person's spirit passes to the land of their ancestors. The exhibit exists with the purpose of honoring missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and transgender and Two-Spirit people, and empowering families to celebrate the lives of their loved ones. The exhibit is a space to come together as a community and actively become a part of reconciliation, supporting missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, transgender, and Two-Spirit people's families in their healing journey and understanding the importance of violence prevention. More information can be found online at shadesofourSisters.com. And now I will invite Stephen Kendall to share with us about the history.
I'd like to again acknowledge the survivors in the room, and grateful for your presence with us. Moderator. For close to 9 decades, from the 1880s to 1969, the Presbyterian Church in Canada cooperated with the government in running 11 residential schools. These schools were located in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. After church union in 1925, 2 schools, Bertel and Cecilia Jeffrey, remained the responsibility of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Cecilia Jeffrey is the school that Cheney Wenjack attended, and at the age of 12, escaped from and died of exposure on train tracks, trying to walk 600 kilometers home. We now know, without any doubt, that the effects of the schools on the 150,000 children who attended them, their families, their communities, and indeed their nations, was devastating. In some eras, the mortality rate at residential schools was close to 50%. Direct and intergenerational effects of malnutrition, abuse, loss of language and culture have all led to this being described as a sad chapter in Canada's history. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada described it as a genocide. Duncan Campbell Scott, head of the Department of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932, stated that he wanted to get rid of the Indian problem. He said that, and I quote, "Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada, not absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question." Over 1,000 individual claims of physical and sexual abuse from former students of our schools have been adjudicated. Thankfully, the tremendous resilience of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people have helped to make us aware of this legacy. They should not have had to do this. We should have been listening to people like, for example, Dr. Peter Bryce, who in 1907 researched and detailed for the government the terrible situation in residential schools and recommended their immediate removal. He was fired after going public with his report. In the early 1990s, the Women's Missionary Society and the Life and Mission Agency were asked to travel to communities around our schools and listen to the accounts of some of the survivors. Those survivors helped us come to realize that as a church, we need to confess to God and to Indigenous people for our role in the legacy of residential schools. So in 1992, a statement of reconciliation was brought for adoption to the General Assembly. It was not approved. Finally, in 1994, our confession was adopted. It was later presented by moderator George Vise, who we acknowledged last night at the opening worship service, and the Women's Missionary Society to Phil Fontaine at the Forks in Winnipeg. Chief Fontaine declined to accept it at the time because he wanted to see how the church would live into the confession. Words must be accompanied by actions. We have been learning what those actions need to be for 25 years now. The words available today in English, French, Korean, Mandarin, Dakota, Ojibwe, and Plains Cree are as relevant as they were 25 years ago. A confession, to be meaningful, needs to establish a relationship of respect. This has been our goal, to be in relationships of respect as we hear from survivors of residential schools, as we learn about our shared history, as we advocate for treaty rights, for clean water, for equal health care, and for excellent self-determined education for Indigenous people. All these efforts relate to the actions that must flow from confession. Bob Canoe, broadcaster and now Manitoba MLA, has said, "The truth about reconciliation is this: it is not a second chance at assimilation. It should not be a kinder, gentler evangelism free from the horrors of residential school era. Rather, true reconciliation is a second chance at building a mutually respectful relationship." Let us pray that as we recommit to the confession and walk forward into the next 25 years of reconciliation, this will be our truth. Moderator, I wonder if I could ask you to invite Terry Brown to the podium.
I would be very happy to do so.
It's a special honor and a deep privilege to introduce to the Assembly Terry Brown from Telegraph Creek in beautiful northern British Columbia. Terry is first a mother, a grandmother, and a survivor. At age 10, she was taken with her brother to be placed in a residential school. A lifelong journey of healing has followed from that experience. Her tremendous strength and many gifts led her to serve as chief of the Tahltan Band. She served 6 years on the Survivors Committee of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and following that, as a member of the Survivors Circle of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation in Winnipeg. Ms. Brown also served on the all-party table, with parties to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, working together with our church and others on the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She brings traditional knowledge and wisdom to all the meetings and was also appointed as elder to the lessons learned process that the parties recently undertook in order to assess the entire agreement. Ms. Brown's strong, perceptive insights have always been both challenging and inspiring. We're very glad to have you with us today.
Thank you, Stephen. And I was really happy to see Stephen here today, since I've known him since the agreement was signed, and he was with the all parties for some time, and it was a pleasure working with him for sure. I want to thank you for your kind invitation to be with you today. I didn't know a soul coming in here, and I didn't Google you or research you all. I thought, well, I'm going to be brave and just walk into an unknown situation. And it's a pleasure. People have been very kind and friendly here today. It is my pleasure to be invited to the beautiful territory of the Anishinaabe people. And my homeland is very far from yours, but I see that you are beautiful people too. Madu from my heart to yours, and Atigidenatia will be with us all and guide us on this journey that we find ourselves on. I do, Stephen asked if there were survivors here today. I believe we have 4. I didn't see who else was standing in the back. Do we have any intergenerational survivors today whose parents or grandparents went to the schools? No? Yeah, we do. Thank you very much for your courage to be here today. I want to stress the importance of having survivors present when you talk about us, when you consult about us, when you want to learn about us, because it's our experience that has brought Canada to where we are today. We gave our stories, gut-wrenching stories, to bring us further ahead and not to fall behind. I have asked that a candle be lit here, that beautiful candle, for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and for all the children who died in the schools who never got to see their parents again. And there were many. I dedicate this talk to our family members who did not return from the schools, and pray that we will be reunited with them one day. My baby sister Ada Brown was killed in Prince George. She will always be forever in our hearts, and the candle is for her. I see you have some pictures of missing and murdered women and girls back there, and I thank you for that. Today is a big day in Gatineau. The report has been finally completed, and it's being revealed, and there are over 200 recommendations to change things. And that is why I do these talks, because I just want to tell you how difficult they are to do at times, because our stories aren't nice stories. People say to me, oh, you're such a strong woman, you've got so much resilience. You know what, I don't want to be that. I really don't. I'd rather be just like carefree and not have a care in the world. But that's not the case for me. My journey has been to share with you what I have experienced so that we can change things for all of us. I honor the life givers who made it possible for our nations to thrive, succeed, and persevere in the face of the greatest assault on any nation, Without the strength and resilience of our ancestors who have gone before us, we would not be here today. I would not be here today. As Stephen mentioned, I was born in a little town. My parents were very traditional people. My father was a trapper. He was not home very much. He worked very hard. And my mother looked after us and raised us. And when our family fell apart at the age of 10, and my brother and I were sent to 2 separate schools in the Yukon. It was the most traumatic part of my life. I will never forget it. In the eyes and heart of a child, my life was destroyed. I cried myself to sleep every night. I couldn't eat the food. I became very skinny because I was accustomed to eating traditional foods. I didn't know what was on the plates when they served them. I hid away most of the time under the bed or in the closets because I was so afraid. The emptiness and hurt I cannot explain. Fortunately for me, I had learned enough about my spiritual ways and beliefs and to strengthen my spirit to persevere. Because of that, I was able to survive. I eventually learned the foreign ways. I learned your language. I learned your way of doing things. I got a university degree and was able to provide for my family. I can't tell you how many of my friends died in the streets, took their own lives, or died because of alcoholism and drugs. And now it's their children who are dying. I have buried many of my friends' children because of fentanyl in BC, where I'm from. When survivors are involved, we need a trauma-informed process, and this was a huge process we went through with the all-parties table, as Stephen will recall. And they believed in us, and they took our recommendations. It's necessary to have survivors involved and to trust the survivors' knowledge and recommendations. The goal is to avoid re-traumatization and to promote resilience among us. And the following objectives apply: trustworthiness, cultural safety. We want our culture accepted wherever we go and not to be shamed for it anymore. Choice and collaboration, and we want a decolonized approach. We must decolonize to reconcile. To decolonize is to say to us, you are worth it, your ways are worth it. As a human being, you are worth it, and we will do that together. The colonized way is wrong, has always been wrong, and until we dismantle it, we will find ourselves in the same situation we find ourselves in today. Colonized efforts are based on white supremacy. Someone is better than the other. Someone is worth more than the other. And that's what the belief system it's based on. And then we would talk, the word genocide is also very important to begin to explore and to accept. And I know as Canadians, it's quite unbelievable that we could have gone down that path. Genocide, the deliberate and systemic destruction of a racial, political, or cultural group. That has happened to us. It's very broad, it's important. In 2 separate reports, we have gone from cultural genocide with the Truth and Reconciliation report to the report that's being released today, which is Canadian genocide. We're getting closer to the truth, and it's important, which it better reflects what happened to us. There are some models which I found in my years of activism and leadership roles, which have worked. I haven't seen too many which I will fully embrace. One of them is Kairos, the Kairos Ecumenical Society. The work they do is absolutely incredible. It's life-changing for many people because it's a model for truth, a model for change, and a model for reconciliation. They consult with Indigenous peoples in their communities on the front lines of demonstrations and activism against governments in Ottawa, New York, or Geneva. I have seen them there, and they walked beside me and they fought for our rights. They were there with me when we formed the Coalition for Stolen Sisters before our own people believed us that we had missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country. They work on important issues such as the land question, human rights, and are not always supported by Canadians because it's very scary when you talk about the land question and people think we're going to come and grab their lands and homes. That's not what our intent is. 5 years ago yesterday, there were 94 calls to action released with the Truth and Reconciliation Report. This government promised to implement every one of them. And I haven't seen a report card since Kairos did one last year, but they were falling behind drastically. As we speak, though, one big call to action is being realized. The final report on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry. The final report is being released today in Gatineau. We are still in the truth phase. We have not moved out of it, and there's much truth to be told in the future. What needs to be fundamentally changed cannot be legislated, written in policy, or forced upon us. It happens in our hearts. Racism, sexism, and classism is prevalent in this country. When we value each other as brothers and sisters, when we can move forward with trust and confidence, then we can say we've done the work. Without the basic human rights, we will continue to see fentanyl overdoses, suicide, male violence against women, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and homelessness. The change must be a heart change. It's about learning to value and love and respect one another. I could think of 2 very recent leaders. I haven't seen it again many times where leadership has been outstanding. I must mention Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott. They have a commitment to do it differently. A different challenging approach to leadership is needed. They put it all on the line for us without any benefit to them. In fact, they lost a lot because of what they did. They did it with disregard of protecting what powers and privilege they held. Is it because they're women and truly believe in change that this happened? Maybe it is, and maybe we need more women like that. The party line is not our way as Indigenous people. What's wrong is wrong and will always be wrong. There's no selling out. Our traditional ways do not allow us to sell out. Keep going. I forgot to check the time when I said it. The Indian Residential School is a part of a bigger picture of colonization. Many other tools have been used, the apprehension of children into social welfare, homelessness, the theft of our lands. All of those things continues. I mentioned the land and resources, which most people never talk about or mention. While I served on the Survivor Committee of the TRC for 6 years, it was all about the truth-telling. The model we developed as survivors worked fairly well in remote, large, and diverse communities. And when we had people from outside of the Indigenous population attend, it was wonderful to see. How can you, I can't say it went well. How can you say something went well when the survivors' hearts were torn from them, broken and damaged, to tell our stories, just to move ahead as a nation? One advantage I see from the commission is that now we're believed. Wherever we go, people talk about what happened, and that is a gift to me as a human being. I will be forever strengthened by the courage and resiliency of the survivors who came forward to tell the truth. Our people who have suffered the worst treatment at the hands of those who love Christ. It was quite Unbelievable what has happened to us. And how do we reconcile that? Many people still go to church and love their church and will never give up on their church and that belief system. But it's difficult one. We heard about rape, starvation, unimaginable sexual assault on children, humiliation, shaming of our culture and language, severe beatings, children burying children, bullying, diseases, and murder, and medical experiments that were done on our helpless children. While we heard the worst side of humanity, we were able to reconnect and to accept one another, because remember, we too never spoke of what happened to us. I never spoke of it until at least the early 2000s, when I first said, yes, I'm a survivor. Hope came from survivors who suffered in the worst ways, and today are able to stand tall and speak their language again, practice our culture and ceremonies and our way of life, which is absolutely essential to our survival. We will be in the truth phase for years to come. The TRC began the important process of truth-telling. However, the truth cannot be told in a few short years. Many survivors and families were not ready to share the truth, and as time goes on, more will step forward to tell their truth. Unfortunately, time is not our friend. Our survivors are passing on at a high rate. There are less than half of us left since the agreement was signed in 2007. There are many tools, as I mentioned, and weapons of colonization. Each time we think we've heard the worst horrific story, we hear something else. The truth phase is moving on to the truth about day schools, which an agreement is going to be signed, the 60 scoops, the Indian hospitals, and forced sterilization of our women. Those truths will be told, and we will become stronger as a nation and move forward and bring the changes so that those things never happen to us again. I'm really, really pleased to be here. I could have been in Gatineau, you know, with the rest of the crew, but I had a commitment to be here with you. And I believe that when I make a commitment, I will follow through on it, because there's a reason that I'm here today. If I change one heart, that's important for me, because that makes a difference. And you will carry my message. I ask you to carry my message forward wherever you go on this journey. It's difficult thinking about Gatineau, because that's been my life's work too. So I thank you all. I wish you all the best.
To thank you for being with us. And you have shared important truth with us today. And I think, well, I'm reminded of another survivor that I once told me that she kept on telling her story, the story of her experience in the residential school. And she said every time it was heart-wrenching, the way you described it and how difficult it was, but she kept telling it because she knew that she was with church people, that we needed to hear, that we needed to understand, so that we could make change and find direction from you of what that change would be. And we are grateful because survivors you have been our leaders in helping us know how our country, how our church, how our peoples need to change. And so I'm so grateful for you continuing to tell that, and the advocacy work that you are doing as part of the Survivor Circle is absolutely wonderful, very important work. So thank you so much.
Moderator, the Presbyterian Church in Canada was responsible for the day-to-day operation of 11 residential schools. There are survivors here today, and among us who know that in these schools, Indigenous children were deprived of their traditional ways, which were replaced with customs that were meant to assimilate them into Euro-Canadian society. To do this, and to complete this process, the Presbyterian Church in Canada used both the physical punishment of children as well as psychological and sexual abuse that happened in those schools. Sometimes children were given physical work to do that was hard and unjust. And in many schools, the quality of food and the quantity of food was insufficient for healthy growth and development. In some of these schools, experiments were conducted on children without their knowledge or their parents' consent. We do not know the full number of children who we took from their homes and forced to leave their families, friends, homes, way of life, and the languages and places that they knew and loved, to attend schools often very far from their families, who thereafter they saw rarely, and in some cases never again. While we have learned much from the courageous testimony of residential school survivors, we do not know fully all the ways that they suffered or continue to suffer. Also incalculable are the families, friends, and communities whose children were taken, and the generations also that follow who still suffer, the scars and heartbreaking legacy of the programs of assimilation that the Church cooperated in by operating the following schools. Ahuzat School, on the traditional territory of the Ahuzat Nation and the broader Nakinal Tribal Council.
Alberni Indian Residential School, British Columbia, on the traditional territory of the Hupakisat and Sitchelt Nations and the broader Nukatot Tribal Council. Bertha Residential School, Manitoba, on the traditional shared land between the Dakota and Ojibwe, also home to the Métis people.
Cecilia Jeffrey Residential School in Ontario, part of Treaty 3 and the traditional territory of the Ojibwe. And Crowstand Residential School, Saskatchewan, part of Treaty 4 land, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Seotak, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation.
Isle Hills Residential School, Saskatchewan. Treaty 4 land, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Residential School, Saskatchewan, later known as Lakes End, Treaty 4, the original land of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation.
Portage La Prairie Residential School, Manitoba. Treaty 1, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Regina Industrial School. Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation.
Round Lake Residential School, Saskatchewan, on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Sioux peoples. Stony Plain Residential School, Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples, and in particular, Paul First Nation, Enoch Cree Nation, Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation, and Alexander Cree Nation.
The Confession of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, as adopted by the General Assembly June 9, 1994. The Holy Spirit, speaking in and through Scripture, calls the Presbyterian Church in Canada to confession. This confession is our response to the Word of God. We understand our mission and ministry in new ways, in part because of the testimony of Aboriginal peoples. We, the 120th General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, seeking the guidance of the Spirit of God and aware of our own sin and shortcomings, are called to speak to the church we love. We do this out of new understandings of our past, not out of any sense of being superior to those who have gone before us, nor out of any sense that we would have done things differently in the same context. It is with humility and in great sorrow that we come before God and our Aboriginal siblings with our confession. We acknowledge that the stated policy of the Government of Canada was to assimilate Aboriginal peoples to the dominant culture, and that the Presbyterian Church in Canada cooperated in this policy. We acknowledge that the roots of the harm we have done are found in the attitudes and values of Western European colonialism, and the assumption that what was not yet molded in our image was to be discovered and exploited. As part of that policy, we, with other churches, encouraged the government to ban some important spiritual practices through which Aboriginal peoples experienced the presence of the Creator God. For the church's complicity in this policy, we ask forgiveness. We recognize that there were many members of the Presbyterian Church in Canada who, in good faith, gave unstintingly of themselves in love and compassion for their Aboriginal brothers and sisters. We acknowledge their devotion and commend them for their work. We recognize that there were some who, with prophetic insight, were aware of the damage that was being done and protested, but their efforts were thwarted. We acknowledge their insight. For the times we did not support them adequately, nor hear their cries for justice, we ask forgiveness. We confess that the Presbyterian Church in Canada presumed to know better than Aboriginal peoples what was needed for life. The Church said of our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, if they could be like us, if they could think like us, talk like us, worship like us, sing like us, and work like us, they would know God and therefore would have life abundant. In our cultural arrogance, we have been blind to the ways in which our own understanding of the gospel has been culturally conditioned. And because of our insensitivity to Aboriginal cultures, we have demanded more of the Aboriginal people than the gospel requires, and have thus misrepresented Jesus Christ, who loves all peoples with compassionate, suffering love, that all may come to God through him. For the Church's presumption, we ask forgiveness. We confess that with the encouragement and assistance of the Government in Canada, the Presbyterian Church in Canada agreed to take the children The Presbyterian Church in Canada agreed to take the children of Aboriginal peoples from their own homes and place them in residential schools. In these schools, children were deprived of their traditional ways, which were replaced with Euro-Canadian customs that were helpful in the process of assimilation. To carry out this process, the Presbyterian Church in Canada used disciplinary practices which were foreign to Aboriginal peoples and open to exploitation in physical and psychological punishment beyond any Christian maxim of care and discipline. In a setting of obedience and acquiescence, there was opportunity for sexual abuse, and some were so abused. The effect of all this for Aboriginal peoples was the loss of cultural identity and the loss of a secure sense of self. For the Church's insensitivity, we ask forgiveness. We regret that there are those whose lives have been deeply scarred by the effects of the mission and ministry of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. For our church, we ask forgiveness of God. It is our prayer that God, who is merciful, will guide us in compassionate ways towards helping them to heal. We ask also for forgiveness from Aboriginal peoples. What we have heard, we acknowledge. It is our hope that those whom we have wronged It is our hope that those whom we have wronged, with a hurt too deep for telling, will accept what we have to say. With God's guidance, our church will seek opportunities to walk with Aboriginal peoples, to find healing and wholeness together as God's people.
Bonjour, das na casa a pema qua, je ne le donne. My name is Laughing Bear and I belong to the Eagle Clan. My name is also Stuart Falster, and I want to sing a song that my brother wrote. Gerald Falster is a strong standing bear, and he is a 3rd degree Medallion medicine man from my reserve, Broken Head Reserve in Manitoba. And he worked with residential school survivors who were sexually abused, and also worked with counseling women who were forcefully sterilized in the 50s and 60s so that they could not have children. That sacred gift was stripped from them. So I had a hard time just reading the words, never mind singing. So, and I don't, you'll have to excuse me, I don't sing as well as he does. And I've invited the members of the National Indigenous Ministry Council to stand with me as I sing. I'm going to sing this song for the healing of our First Nations peoples that were abused in the boarding schools. I offer this song, and should this song be used in a public place, I ask that it not be used for a continuation of violent episodes. Hey, hey, so you want to own the world that you're living in. Hey, 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 I must have a lot of power that you're yielding in a sword that you're holding in your hand. Hey, hey, so you want to own the world that you're living in? Oh, you must have a lot of power that you're yielding in a sword that you're holding in your hand. Hey, hey, so you want to own the world? Oh, you must have a lot of change in your pockets there. You think we're gonna forget about the time when you dragged the children away in the middle of the night? Hey, hey, no, it wasn't right. Hey, so you want to make amends to the children? What about the ones? Can you make amends to the ones that are buried underneath the ground? Hey, hey, so you want to own the world that you're living in? You want to own anything that crawls on the earth, anything that's walking, everything swimming in the ocean or flying in the sky. You want to own the sickness, the pain of the children, and crying in the middle of the night. Hey, were you there when I held this woman in my arms, when they took her away to the boarding school, and she wasn't living by the golden rule? Hey, hey, were you there when she cried all day long when I held her in my arms? Hey, hey, oh, you must have a lot of power that you're yielding in the sword that's in your hands. You want to own the stars? Oh, the stars in the sacred night. everything that's moving around in the world that we're living in. Did you forget about the time when you took away the land, took away our home, took us away from the world that we're living in? We ain't got no power, we ain't got no money, we ain't got nothing. We just got along, just got our healing ways, our spiritual lives that we're living now in the middle of the night. Hey, hey, You think we will forget about the children that were taken? When they walk on the street and they laugh at us, and we live in the city again, then they laugh at us when we go to the store. They talk about us, they call us names, they put us in the dark light, they put us in the darkness of our lives. Hey, hey, hey. Now they call us bums. When walking on the street, they call us drunken bums. Anyway, they tell us to look the other way. They tell us we don't belong. Can't find a job. We can't find a life. Hey neighbor, we're gonna forget about the children that you drag off in the middle of the night. Hey, you took away their sacred rights. Hey, hey, Now the children, they don't finish school. They don't live by your golden rule anymore. Hey, hey, Don't learn nothing in school because the name doesn't count. Even the colorless and a world that doesn't understand, a world that doesn't care, a world that looks away, excluded from everything. Even television doesn't mean nothing. We don't exist anymore. So you want to make amends? How do you make amends for a broken part of the service? People dying from the age of being AIDS, sickness. People committed suicide, hang themselves. No reason for living in the darkness, living in the hey, hey, I wish it was a happier ending.
Stuart, thank you. I trust that it's not the ending. The story continues and we continue to watch it.
Let me introduce you myself first. My name is Brian Harper. I'm from Red Sucker Lake of Manitoba, the hometown of Elijah Hart. I just want to say something. I just want to say from the bottom of my heart that we're all forgiven. And I just want to say something about the good thing about residential school. I'm an intergenerational residential school survivor. I'm a residential school survivor. I went to residential school. My grandparents went to residential school. I don't know why my parents sent me to residential school. But there's one good thing, what my uncle said about residential school, is they taught me how to speak English. And they taught me how to say no.
That's one good thing about residential school. And our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, another Harper, he was courage and boldness to say, I'm sorry. And some, maybe half of the Aboriginal people and the indigenous peoples across this country, I'm very sure they said, you're forgiven. And that's we, as Presbyterian Church in Canada, we accept that upon us. Just to be on a happy ending, because I'm part of you, I'm Presbyterian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that, and trust that we know that asking forgiveness and offering forgiveness are a step, and we're committed to continue to walk the journey until the truth has fully been told. We've been told we need to keep hearing truth, and that healing and true reconciliation can take place. Thank you. I invite you to join with me in prayer. God of our ancestors, who holds the spirits of our grandmothers and grandfathers and the spirits of our grandchildren, remembering the children, we now pledge ourselves to speak the truth, and with our hearts and our souls to act upon the truth we have heard, of the injustices lived, of the sufferings inflicted, of the tears cried, of the misguided intentions imposed, and of the power of prejudice and racism which were allowed to smother the sounds of laughter of the forgotten children. Hear our cries of lament for what was allowed to happen and for what will never be. In speaking and hearing and acting upon the truth, may we as individuals and as a church meet the hope of a new beginning. Creator God, who desires that all creation live in harmony and peace. Remembering the children, we commit to walking the paths of reconciliation, where apology from the heart leads to healing of the heart and the chance of restoring the circle, where justice walks with all, where respect leads to true partnership, where the power to change comes from each heart. Hear our prayer of hope and guide your church to seek opportunities to walk in new and good ways with Indigenous peoples, and to find healing and wholeness together as your people as we recommit ourselves to healing and reconciliation. Amen. I'll now invite Reverend Margaret Mullen to come back and lead us in the next piece.
My name is Thundering Eagle Woman. I'm from Bingway, Ayashie, Anishinaabe, which is in northwestern Ontario. I am Anishinaabe Kwe. My spirit name is Thundering Eagle Woman. My name is Margaret Mullen. I'm just here to introduce, we have suggested that there is a sharing circle at each of the round tables. So each table itself will become a sharing time. There's rocks at your table, and we're going to ask you to use the rocks in your hand
one person can pick up the rock, and you keep that in your hand as you share. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that, but you keep the rock in your hand as you share, and then go clockwise around the table. Whoever has the rock in their hand is the person who is speaking, and everyone else just listens with respect. We're asking each of you to share from your heart. There will be people at your table who may agree with you, or they may not agree with you. So this is, in the sharing circle, is a sacred circle in our tradition. And so in the middle is Christ, Jesus, Creator. We're gathered together around the Spirit, sharing what is in our hearts with everyone else who is around the table. I'm going to ask if the people from the National Indigenous Ministries Council start making your way now. Just find yourselves to a table with the commissioners, and so that we can be also included in that sharing as it happens around the table. I'm asking everybody also to be respectful of time, because a true sharing circle, even though it's that small, could take an hour or 2 hours. And so just be respectful of the time that you have around the table. We're suggesting a half an hour, but it won't be cut off just right at the end of a half an hour. So share around your table. What we're asking you to share is how we find healing and wholeness together as God's people, as we together recommit ourselves to healing and reconciliation.
Microphone number 1.
Margaret, it was not always an easy lesson to learn, but I learned long ago to pay attention to the promptings of the Holy Spirit. And I've been sitting greatly moved through this whole session of remembering the confession, and deeply concerned that as we have spoken about truth and reconciliation, thinking about the words of Chief Fontaine, who refused to receive the apology until he saw what we did. And I'm very aware of the Council of Indigenous Ministries sitting at the back of the room, on the side of the room, and not having a seat at the table, in any real sense. We have so many bodies that have direct access to sit with us when we sit as an assembly, to speak directly to assembly. But still, we make our Indigenous brothers and sisters speak to us through the cipher of justice ministries or special events and special occasions. And I'm hopeful that if we are serious about what we have said about reconciliation, then foremost among anything that we do is to acknowledge you as equals and friends and partners in the journey, not as children who need us to tell you what to do or how it should be done. And I am hopeful that as we speak around these tables, we might find the grace and the strength to say that it's time that at our assembly as a church, our Indigenous brothers and sisters should be fully present, fully heard, with a full voice, that they do not need the cipher of colonial era structures to permit you to speak or invite you to speak, that you need to have a voice that is yours, not one that's loaned to you or given to you.
Miigwech. And so we're asking you to share what thoughts or feelings that you do experience here today, as you listen to the confession, as you listen to the sharing that happened. What acts of reconciliation have you actually seen in your community, either through the church, your church, or the community that you live in? And do you think that the church has made much change since 1994 when the confession was offered? So these rocks that you have, they were gathered over a period of about 5 years from a stretch of shore along North Lake Ontario. The land where they were gathered is part of the Williams Treaty in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Given what we know of the glacial and watershed history of this area and the diversity of appearance and composition of the rocks, it is very likely that some of them may have traveled great distances to come from other traditional lands, as we all come from great distances and come from other traditions and cultures and languages. So please, at the end of the time, Amanda will call time, and I'm going to ask her if she would just have a prayer to pull it together. I also would like to know what has happened at the table, so if one person could just jot some notes. I don't need to know who or what or when, but the National Indigenous Ministries Committee is continuing to meet, and it would be nice to hear what your comments are. So just on a scrap of paper can be left over here on this square table. We'll read it. Thank you, Margaret.
I'd like you to turn into your circles. Invite members of the Indigenous Council to come join you.